Ethan and I are expecting a baby boy. Applause thundered through the living room as the family cheered. Zuri, standing frozen in the foyer with surprise gifts after months away on business, felt her blood run cold. The woman making the toast wasn't just holding court in Zuri's home, she was wearing Zuri's wedding ring. This mistress acted like she owned the mansion, convinced she had successfully replaced the absentee wife. She was wrong. The wife returned, unexpected, and she wasn't there to join the party. She was there to end it. Stay tuned to witness Zuri's satisfying master plan unfold. If you walked in on this nightmare, would you scream or plot in silence? Let us know in the comments and hit subscribe for more justice. The leather steering wheel felt cool under Zuri Harrington's palms, a grounding sensation against the nervous flutter in her chest. 6 months. That was how long the acquisition in Singapore had kept her away. A timeline that had stretched from weeks into an agonizing half-year of video calls and lonely hotel nights. Beside her on the passenger seat sat a small velvet-wrapped box containing a vintage Patek Philippe watch for Ethan and 2 limited-edition robotics kits for the twins. She had pushed the flight up by 2 days, desperate to surprise them, playing the scene over in her head like a favorite movie clip. The wideness of Mia's eyes, Jonah's gap-toothed grin, and the way Ethan would drop whatever he was holding to pull her into the kind of embrace that made the rest of the world dissolve. Zuri checked her makeup in the rearview mirror, smoothing a stray curl, needing everything to be perfect. She wasn't just returning to a house, she was returning to her life. However, as the iron gates of the Mallory estate swung open, the fantasy began to fracture. The driveway, usually pristine and empty at this hour, was cluttered with luxury sedans Zuri didn't recognize. A silver Porsche, a red convertible, and several SUVs blocking the path to the garage. She parked on the grass, a frown creasing her forehead as she gathered her gifts. As she walked up the stone path, the front door stood ajar, letting out the hum of conversation and the clink of glassware. Maria, the head housekeeper who had been with them since the twins were born, stepped out to shake a rug but froze when she saw Zuri. Instead of the usual warm greeting, Maria's eyes widened in genuine panic. She mumbled something unintelligible, dipped her head, and hurriedly retreated inside, as if she had been caught witnessing a crime. The coldness of the reception sent a prickle of unease down Zuri's spine, but she forced a smile, telling herself it was just a surprise party she had forgotten. Or perhaps Vivian was hosting a charity brunch. Stepping into the foyer, the air was thick with the scent of vanilla, roasting meat, and a perfume that was decidedly not hers. Something floral and aggressive that masked the familiar cedarwood aroma of her home. The living room was bathed in golden afternoon light, creating a picture-perfect tableau of domestic bliss that stopped Zuri dead in her tracks. There were about a dozen people, mostly Ethan's relatives and a few business partners, but the gravitational center of the room wasn't Vivian, the matriarch, nor was it Ethan. It was a woman Zuri had never met. She was seated on the plush beige sofa, Zuri's favorite reading spot, wearing a silk dress that draped effortlessly over her frame. Her hair was a cascading wave of honey blonde, perfectly styled, and she was leaning forward toward Vivian with a familiarity that made Zuri's breath hitch. The woman laughed, a tinkling practice sound, and reached out to wipe a smudge of frosting from Vivian's cheek with her thumb. It was a gesture of such casual, intimate possession that it felt violent. Vivian didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned into the touch, beaming at the stranger with a look of adoration she usually reserved for the grandchildren. "Oh, you are terrible, Lexi," Vivian chuckled, patting the woman's knee. "But you know exactly what Ethan likes." Zuri stood in the archway, the gift boxes heavy in her arms, feeling the blood drain from her face. It was the uncanny valley of her own life. Everything looked like her home, but the coordinates were wrong, the roles recast. She took a step forward, her heels clicking on the hardwood, and the sound finally cut through the chatter. Heads turned. The laughter died down, replaced by a suffocating silence that swept through the room like a cold draft. "Zuri!" The voice belonged to Ethan. He emerged from the kitchen holding a bottle of wine, his face draining of color as he took in the sight of his wife. He didn't rush to her. He didn't drop the bottle. He froze, his eyes darting toward the woman on the sofa before flickering back to Zuri with a mixture of guilt and annoyance. You're, you're back. I thought your flight was Thursday. I wanted to surprise you, Zuri said, her voice sounding thin and foreign to her own ears. She looked at the woman named Lexi, expecting an introduction, an explanation, anything. Lexi didn't stand up. She merely turned her head, assessing Zuri with cool, heavy-lidded eyes that held no surprise, only a territorial calculation. She took a sip of her wine, and that was when the second blow landed. As Lexi raised the crystal flute, the afternoon sun caught the ring on her finger. It wasn't just any ring. It was a 3-carat oval diamond with a hidden halo of sapphires, Zuri's wedding ring. The one she had left in the master suite safe because she was terrified of losing it during her site inspections in Asia. The room spun. The object that symbolized her vows, her history, and her promise was now sliding up and down the finger of a stranger who looked at Zuri as if she were the intruder. Before Zuri could articulate the horror rising in her throat, the sound of running feet thundered from the hallway. "Mommy!" Zuri's heart leaped. She dropped the boxes, disregarding the expensive watch, and dropped to her knees, opening her arms wide for Mia and Jonah. She braced herself for the impact of their small bodies, the smell of their shampoo, the unconditional love that would anchor her back to reality. But the impact never came. Mia, her 7-year-old daughter, sprinted right past Zuri's outstretched arms. She didn't even slow down. She ran straight to the sofa and threw herself into Lexi's lap. "Lexi, look! I finished the drawing you wanted!" Mia squealed, shoving a piece of paper into the woman's face. Jonah followed slower, giving Zuri a confused, fleeting wave before gravitating toward Ethan, who placed a protective hand on the boy's shoulder, anchoring him away from his mother. Zuri remained kneeling, her arms still open, embracing nothing but empty air. The humiliation was physical, a sharp, twisting pain in her gut. She slowly lowered her hands, feeling the gaze of every guest burning into her back. These people, her neighbors, her in-laws, were watching her disintegration with pity, but mostly with the discomfort of an audience watching a play go off script. "Mia," Zuri whispered, standing up on shaky legs. "Baby, Mommy's home." "Oh, hi, Mom," Mia said, barely looking up from Lexi's lap. Lexi stroked Mia's hair, her fingers long and manicured, looking at Zuri with a small, triumphant smile. "Zuri, please," Ethan said, stepping between them, his voice lowered to a harsh whisper. "Don't make a scene. We're in the middle of a celebration." "A celebration?" Zuri asked, her eyes darting from her ring on Lexi's finger to her mother-in-law, who was now studiously examining her napkin to avoid eye contact. "What exactly are we celebrating, Ethan? With my ring? In my house?" Lexi stood up then. She smoothed her dress over her stomach, a movement that drew every eye in the room. She walked over to Ethan, linking her arm through his, creating a united front that physically walled Zuri out. "We were going to call you, Zuri," Lexi said, her voice silky and terrifyingly calm, as if she were speaking to a mentally unstable patient. "But since you're here, you might as well know with everyone else." She looked up at Ethan, beaming, then turned back to the crowd, raising her glass again. "Ethan and I are expecting," Lexi announced, her other hand resting gently on her flat stomach. "A baby boy. The heir this family has been waiting for?" The room erupted in applause. Vivian let out a cry of delight, rushing forward to hug Lexi, kissing her cheeks, tears of joy streaming down her face. Ethan smiled, a weak, terrified smile, as people clapped him on the back. Zuri stood alone near the doorway, the forgotten gifts at her feet, watching the people she loved celebrate her erasure. She realized then, with a clarity that cut deeper than any knife, that she hadn't just been cheated on. She had been replaced, piece by piece, until there was no space left in the mansion for the woman who owned it. The celebration downstairs did not end with Zuri's arrival. Instead, it mutated into something grotesque, a strained performance of normalcy where the guests continued to sip champagne while studiously avoiding eye contact with the woman who actually owned the roof over their heads. Zuri moved through the living room like a specter, her physical presence undeniable, yet entirely unacknowledged, as the air grew heavy with the unspoken consensus that she was the inconvenience interrupting a perfect family portrait. She attempted to gravitate toward the twins, who were currently sprawled on the Persian rug, engrossed in new, flashy electronic tablets that clearly hadn't come from their father. But as she knelt beside them, the emotional distance felt wider than the Pacific Ocean she had just crossed. When she reached out to stroke Mia's hair, the girl flinched imperceptibly, her eyes glued to the screen as she muttered a sentence that struck Zuri with the force of a physical blow. Mom, Lexi said you'd be super busy with your meetings, so she told us not to bother you because you probably wouldn't stay long anyway. The innocence in Mia's voice was the cruelest part, a clear indication that this narrative, Zuri as the absentee, work-obsessed mother, had been fed to them systematically over months until it became their absolute truth. Jonah, usually the more sensitive of the two, didn't even look up, merely asking if Lexi was going to cut the cake soon, a question that severed the last thread of Zuri's composure and sent her standing upright just as Ethan materialized at her elbow. He didn't touch her, didn't offer a hug or a hand, but instead steered her toward the staircase with a nervous energy, his eyes darting to his phone screen and then over her shoulder, anywhere but at her face. He spoke in a hushed, frantic whisper, accusing her of ambushing them, twisting her early arrival into a lack of consideration for the delicate ecosystem the family had built in her absence. You can't just vanish for half a year and expect everything to be frozen in time, Zuri, Ethan said as they ascended the stairs, his voice dripping with a defensive victimhood that made Zuri's stomach turn. We had to survive. We had to rely on each other, and Lexi, she stepped up when you chose the company over us. The gaslighting was subtle yet suffocating, designed to make her question her own memory of the daily video calls he had shortened, the trips he had encouraged her to take, and the assurances that everything at home was fine. He ushered her into the master bedroom, and the moment the door clicked shut, the reality of her displacement assaulted her senses. The room did not smell like her. The calming notes of lavender and chamomile she had curated for years were obliterated by the sharp, aggressive stench of Dior's poison, a heavy, musky perfume that hung in the air like a toxic fog. Zuri stood paralyzed in the center of the room, her eyes scanning the space that felt like a crime scene where the victim was her former self. Her vanity table, once organized with her specific skincare regimen, was now a chaotic shrine to another woman, cluttered with gold-capped bottles, hair extensions, and jewelry dishes overflowing with trinkets that Zuri had never bought. Walking to the walk-in closet, she felt a bile rise in her throat when she saw her clothes pushed to the far, dark end of the rack, compressed into a sliver of space to make room for rows of silk dresses, designer coats, and lingerie that screamed of a lifestyle financed by Zuri's own hard work. A pair of red-soled stilettos sat explicitly in the center of the room, not put away, but placed there like a flag planted on conquered territory. When she turned to confront Ethan, he was already retreating toward the balcony doors, muttering about needing air, his refusal to engage in the visual evidence of his betrayal, rendering him cowardly and small. Before Zuri could scream, the door opened softly and Vivian slipped in, her expression a mask of pity that felt more insulting than hatred. The older woman didn't apologize. Instead, she walked over to the bed, which now sported duvet covers and a jarring crimson Zuri would never have chosen, and sat down, patting the space beside her as if inviting Zuri to a reasonable negotiation. Vivian spoke of how helpful Lexi had been, how she drove Vivian to her physical therapy, how she organized the household staff, and how, essentially, she had become the wife Ethan needed while Zuri was playing CEO across the globe. You have to understand, darling, a home needs a heart, and you were just a paycheck, Vivian said, her voice trembling with a self-righteous sincerity that made Zuri realize the indoctrination was complete. Don't let your ego ruin this family. Lexi is fragile right now with the baby, so please just be graceful. That word, graceful, was the catalyst that snapped Zuri out of her shock. They didn't want her back. They wanted her permission to continue erasing her. They wanted her to silently fund this charade while fading into the background. The suffocation in the room became unbearable, the walls closing in with the weight of the lies they had all agreed to believe. Zuri didn't argue, didn't throw the perfume bottles against the wall as she desperately wanted to, because she realized in that cold, crystalline moment that screaming would only validate their narrative of her as the hysterical, unstable woman. She needed to be smarter. Without a word to her mother-in-law or her husband, Zuri grabbed her travel bag, which she hadn't even unpacked, and walked back out the door. She passed Ethan on the landing, who looked relieved rather than remorseful, assuming she was retreating to a guest room or perhaps leaving to cool off and accept her new, diminished status. She descended the stairs, ignoring the party that was now raucous with laughter, Lexi's laugh ringing loudest of all, and walked out into the cool evening air, getting into her car and driving away from the estate that was no longer her home. Checking into a sterile, high-end hotel suite downtown, Zuri sat on the edge of the bed in the silence, the adrenaline finally fading into a cold, calculating clarity. She pulled out her phone and began scrolling back through months of messages, not looking for sentiment, but for patterns. The canceled calls, the vague excuses, the sudden increases in credit card notifications she had ignored in her busyness. She wasn't crying anymore. The woman who had driven up the driveway with gifts and hope was gone, replaced by someone who realized that this level of orchestration wasn't an accident, but a heist. As she looked at her reflection in the dark window, Zuri knew she wasn't just fighting for a marriage. That was dead. She was fighting to reclaim her identity from thieves who had smiled while they stole it. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Slate, a minimalist coffee shop on the edge of the financial district, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished concrete floor that mirrored the fractured state of Zuri's world. She sat in a corner booth, her back rigid against the leather, a cup of untouched black coffee cooling in front of her as she watched the city wake up, a stark contrast to the sleepless purgatory she had endured in her hotel room. Zuri was no longer the disoriented wife who had stumbled out of her mansion the night before. The shock had calcified into a cold, hard knot of anticipation, the kind she usually reserved for hostile board takeovers. When Mason arrived, he didn't offer a hug or a pitying look, nor did he waste time with empty platitudes about how things would get better. Mason, a corporate shark whose ruthlessness was only matched by his loyalty to Zuri, simply slid into the seat opposite her and slammed a 3-inch thick manila folder onto the table with a heavy, ominous thud that caused the coffee in her cup to ripple. "You are not going to like what is in here," Mason said, his voice low and devoid of sugarcoating. "But it is the ammunition you need to stop feeling like a victim and start acting like the owner." Zuri placed her hand on the folder, feeling the texture of the paper, and nodded for him to proceed, bracing herself as he flipped open the cover to reveal a forensic dismantling of her life. The first section was financial, a labyrinth of transactions that painted a picture of betrayal far more calculated than a simple affair. Mason guided her through the columns of numbers, pointing out withdrawals from the joint account she rarely monitored, highlighting transfers labeled home maintenance that had been funneled directly into a shadow account opened in Ethan's name, but accessed almost exclusively from an IP address registered to Lexi's phone. The most gut-wrenching blow came when Mason pulled out a printed bank statement from 3 months prior, circling a $10,000 transfer Zuri had authorized from Singapore after Ethan had called her in a panic, claiming the mansion's HVAC system had catastrophically failed and threatened to ruin the antique flooring. "There was no HVAC repair, Zuri," Mason said, sliding a surveillance photograph across the table that showed Lexi and Ethan laughing on a private boat charter in Cabo San Lucas, dated the exact weekend of the alleged repair. "You paid for their baby moon." The nausea rose in Zuri's throat, hot and acidic, but she swallowed it down, forcing her eyes to focus on the next photograph, which featured Lexi exiting a high-end boutique, swinging a quilted Chanel handbag. The very limited edition bag Zuri had admired online, but decided was too frivolous to buy for herself. The realization that her hard-earned money, the fruit of her sleepless nights and missed milestones, had been used to accessorize the woman replacing her, was a violation that transcended infidelity. It was financial cannibalism. But the betrayal ran deeper than money, spiraling into a conspiracy that involved blood. Mason produced a transcript of text messages recovered by his private investigator, a conversation thread between Lexi and Chloe, Ethan's sister, whom Zuri had put through design school. The texts were a masterclass in manipulation, with Chloe coaching Lexi on how to dismantle Zuri's presence in the house systematically. Vivian loves to feel needed, Chloe had written in a message dated 4 months ago. Zuri just throws money at problems, but you need to ask mom for advice on cooking, on the kids, on everything. Make her feel like the matriarch again, and she'll forget Zuri ever existed. Another message from Chloe read, throw away those ugly aromatherapy candles Zuri likes. Tell Ethan they give you migraines. He'll believe anything if you look fragile enough. Zuri read the words, feeling the sting of 1,000 paper cuts, realizing that the coldness she had felt from her mother-in-law wasn't natural decay, but a carefully cultivated poisoning orchestrated by the sister-in-law she had treated like a daughter. We also spoke to Ellen, Mason added, referring to the housekeeper who had looked so terrified the previous day. She was too scared to go on record officially yet, but she sent me this statement. He pushed a piece of paper forward, detailing Ellen's account of how Lexi had begun visiting the house mere weeks after Zuri's departure, brought in by Chloe, who introduced her as a consultant, and how Lexi had gradually begun ordering the staff to move Zuri's belongings into storage, claiming it was Ethan's request to declutter. Ellen's testimony confirmed that the staff had been threatened with termination if they mentioned Lexi's presence to Zuri during their brief video calls. But this, Mason said, his voice dropping an octave as he reached for the final, thin black folder at the bottom of the stack, is the nail in the coffin. He opened it to reveal a medical dossier, or rather, the lack of one. The investigator had run a background check on Lexi Monroe's medical history, cross-referencing the obstetricians in the state. There were no appointments, no prenatal vitamins prescriptions, no records of a heartbeat. Instead, Mason produced a printout from a website called Novelty Docs.com, a service that specialized in creating realistic-looking fake medical paperwork and ultrasounds for pranks or theater. The ultrasound image Lexi had framed on the mantelpiece, the one Vivian had cried over, was a stock image available for download for $9. $9. She isn't pregnant, Zuri, Mason stated, watching her reaction closely. She bought a silicone belly online 3 weeks ago. We found the receipt linked to her PayPal. It's a long con to secure a marriage license and access to the trust fund before you returned, but you came back early. The silence that settled over the table was heavy, charged with the electricity of a coming storm. Zuri stared at the fake ultrasound, the pieces of the puzzle locking together with a satisfying, terrible click. The nausea was gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline rage that sharpened her vision and steadied her hands. She wasn't just a wife who had been cheated on. She was the CEO of her own life who had uncovered corporate espionage within her own home. She looked up at Mason, her eyes dry and burning with a new, terrifying intensity. She didn't want to hide in the hotel anymore. She didn't want to retreat. They think I'm weak, Zuri said, her voice steady, closing the file with a deliberate slowness. They think I'm just the bank account, the absentee mother who can be erased with a few lies and a fake pregnancy. What do you want to do? Mason asked, already knowing the answer as he pulled a pen from his pocket. I want to go to dinner, Zuri replied, a dangerous smile touching the corners of her lips for the first time in 24 hours. And I want you to prepare the eviction notices, the divorce papers, and the forensic audit. Tonight, I'm not just going back to that house to visit. I'm going back to burn their little fantasy to the ground. The invitation Zuri had sent via her executive assistant was a masterclass in corporate ambiguity, titled simply Family Reconciliation Dinner, a phrase that had successfully lured every conspirator back to the scene of the crime under the false pretense of a surrender. The dining room of the Mallory estate, usually a sanctuary of understated elegance, had been transformed into a stage for Lexi's ego, the table set with the heavy gold-rimmed china that was strictly reserved for Christmas, and the air thick with the scent of lilies, a flower Zuri was notoriously allergic to. Lexi sat at the foot of the table, opposite where Ethan sat at the head, effectively usurping the hostess position, wearing a tight crimson dress that accentuated the silicone bump beneath the fabric while she barked orders at the serving staff with the haughty cadence of someone who had never actually managed a household. Vivian was beaming, clearly interpreting Zuri's presence as an admission of defeat, chirping happily about how wonderful it was to have both of Ethan's girls breaking bread together, a statement so delusional it almost made Zuri laugh as she took her seat not at the head, but in the center, flanked by a silent, terrified Ethan and a smug, scrolling Chloe. Zuri did not touch the appetizer. Instead, she placed a sleek, silver laptop on the pristine tablecloth, its metallic surface gleaming under the chandelier like a blade drawn in a knife fight. For the first 20 minutes, Zuri allowed the charade to play out, observing the way Chloe winked at Lexi across the centerpiece and how Ethan drank his scotch with the desperate thirst of a man drowning in his own guilt. Until Lexi, emboldened by the silence, raised her glass to propose a toast to new beginnings and forgiving the past. "I think that is an excellent idea, Lexi," Zuri said, her voice cutting through the room with the smooth, cool precision of a scalpel. "But before we move forward, I think we should clear up a few administrative errors regarding the family assets." Without waiting for permission, Zuri flipped open the laptop, the screen coming to life with a harsh blue light that illuminated the faces of her diners, casting long, grotesque shadows against the silk wallpaper. She pressed a single key, and the smart TV mounted above the fireplace, usually reserved for Ethan's market updates, flickered on, mirroring her laptop screen to display a complex spreadsheet highlighted in damning red ink. "I spent the morning with the forensic accountants, Ethan," Zuri began, ignoring his sudden choked cough, "and it appears that while I was securing the merger in Singapore, our joint liquidity dropped by 40%, largely due to transfers labeled medical expenses that were actually routed to a shell company registered to a Ms. Alexis Monroe." Lexi lowered her glass, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second before she regained her composure. But Zuri was already moving to the next slide, a series of high-resolution photographs taken by the private investigator. They showed Lexi and Ethan on a yacht, Lexi driving Zuri's vintage convertible, and most damningly, Lexi purchasing a $20,000 Birkin bag using a credit card that Zuri had specifically set aside for the twins' college fund. The room went deathly quiet, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, as Vivian looked from the screen to her son, her expression shifting from confusion to a dawning, horrified realization. "And Chloe," Zuri continued, turning her gaze to her sister-in-law who was currently trying to slide her phone under the table. "I found your contributions to my household management particularly insightful." With another keystroke, the screen shifted to a scrolling transcript of text messages, the font enlarged so every vicious word was legible from the back of the room. The conversation between Chloe and Lexi was a manifesto of malice, detailing how to isolate Vivian, how to manipulate Ethan's insecurities, and specifically Chloe's advice to get pregnant fast because Zuri won't divorce a man with a baby on the way. The silence in the room shattered when Chloe, reading her own hateful words projected in 4K resolution, dropped her silver fork. The utensil hit the fine china plate with a violence that sounded like a gunshot, the sharp clink echoing the sudden fracture of her moral high ground. That's out of context," Chloe stammered, her face flushing a deep, ugly red. But Vivian turned on her daughter with a look of betrayal that suggested the older woman was finally waking up from her coma of denial. "But the pièce de résistance," Zuri said, her voice dropping to a whisper that forced everyone to lean in, "is the heir we are all celebrating." She pulled a single piece of paper from under the laptop and slid it across the mahogany table toward Lexi, a printed invoice from Novelty Docs. "Com for 1, premium silicone gestational belly, trimester 2, and a set of falsified ultrasound JPEGs." Lexi stared at the paper, her face draining of all color until her makeup stood out like war paint on a corpse, while Ethan snatched the paper, his eyes scanning the lines before he looked at Lexi's stomach with a mixture of revulsion and shock. "It's fake," Ethan whispered, the air leaving his lungs as the reality of his entrapment crashed down on him. "There is no baby?" That was the moment the facade broke completely. Lexi did not cry. She did not apologize. Instead, she stood up so abruptly that her chair toppled backward with a deafening crash, her sophisticated mask dissolving to reveal the cornered, vicious grifter beneath. She began to scream, a guttural, profanity-laced tirade accusing Zuri of being a frigid workaholic who deserved to be robbed. her hands flailing as she knocked over a crystal vase, sending water and flowers cascading onto the expensive rug. She pointed a manicured finger at Ethan, calling him a spineless coward, and then at Vivian, mocking the old woman's gullibility, stripping away every layer of the elegance she had faked for months. Amidst the chaos of Lexi's screeching and Ethan's stammering and Vivian's sobbing, Zuri remained seated, the only motionless figure in a room spinning out of control. She reached for her glass of wine, a vintage she had bought for her 10th anniversary, and took a slow, deliberate sip, the rich liquid coating her tongue as she watched Lexi unravel. Zuri did not engage, did not shout back, did not descend into the mud. She simply watched the fire she had lit consume the house of cards, her silence ringing louder than Lexi's screams, establishing once and for all that the woman at the head of the table was not the mistress who shouted, but the wife who judged. "I think dinner's over," Zuri said calmly, closing her laptop with a final decisive snap that cut through Lexi's hysteria like a gavel striking a block. "Now we discuss the eviction." The echo of Lexi's shattered glass vase had barely faded when the heavy oak doors of the dining room swung open, admitting not the dessert course, but two imposing figures who sucked the remaining air out of the room. They were men cut from granite, dressed in identical black tactical suits that seemed jarringly out of place against the floral wallpaper, their earpieces coiling down their necks like plastic snakes. They did not announce themselves, nor did they look at Ethan for permission. They looked only at Zuri, standing like sentinels awaiting a command from their general. Zuri did not look up from her wine glass as she gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of absolute authority that signaled the end of the domestic drama and the beginning of the legal execution. Mason, who had been waiting in the foyer, stepped into the room behind them, his face impassive as he placed a document on the table in front of the sobbing, hysterical Lexi. It was not a settlement offer, but a formal notice of trespassing and immediate eviction, backed by a restraining order that Zuri had signed an hour before dinner. Lexi stared at the paper, her mascara running in rivulets down her cheeks, and attempted to rally one last defense, screeching that she was carrying the Mallory air and that no hired muscle could touch her. Zuri merely raised an eyebrow and pointed to the silicone belly that had shifted slightly during Lexi's tantrum, the illusion of maternity now looking as cheap and fraudulent as the woman herself. "You are not a resident, you are not a guest, and you are certainly not a mother," Zuri said, her voice devoid of the anger Lexi desperately wanted to provoke. "You are an intruder who has committed credit card fraud and identity theft across 3 state lines, and these gentlemen are here to ensure you leave before the police arrive to take you to a cell, which is the only free housing you will be getting tonight." When Lexi turned to Ethan, screaming for him to do something, to be a man, to protect their future, Ethan simply slumped further into his chair, his head in his hands, unable to look at the woman who had played him for a fool. The security guards moved with efficient, silent brutality. One took Lexi by the elbow, not gently, but with the firm grip used for an unruly patron, while the other collected her purse. There was no time for her to pack, no time to steal one last trinket. She was marched out of the French doors, her protests fading into the night air, until the click of the lock signaled the excision of the cancer that had been eating away at the family. With the primary antagonist removed, the silence that fell over the room was heavy with judgment. Zuri turned her gaze to Chloe, who was trembling so violently her water glass rattled against the table. Chloe tried to stammer an apology, mumbling about how she had been manipulated, how she just wanted the family to be happy. But Zuri cut her off with a raised hand. She didn't shout. Instead, she detailed the consequences with the cold precision of a firing squad. Chloe was effectively removed from the board of directors of Zuri's lifestyle brand. Her company credit cards were canceled as they spoke, and the tuition payments for her Design Masters program were terminated effective immediately. "You wanted to engineer my replacement because you thought I was too strict with the finances," Zuri said, watching the color drain from her sister-in-law's face. "Now you can see how far your creativity gets you without my funding. I don't want to see you in this house, Chloe. Not for Thanksgiving, not for Christmas. You didn't just betray me. You sold me out for a counterfeit handbag." Chloe fled the room in tears, leaving only the wreckage of the marriage at the table. Vivian, who had been weeping silently into her napkin, reached out a trembling hand toward Zuri, whispering a plea for forgiveness, acknowledging her foolishness in being blinded by the prospect of a grandchild. Zuri looked at her mother-in-law, the woman she had once viewed as a second mother, and felt a profound, exhausting sadness. She didn't pull away, but she didn't offer comfort either. She simply stated that trust was a currency Vivian had spent recklessly, and while she would not banish the grandmother of her children, the days of open access and unconditional support were over. Vivian nodded, understanding the new boundaries, and quietly excused herself, leaving Zuri and Ethan alone in the debris of their life. Ethan finally looked up, his eyes red and swollen, the arrogance of the patriarch completely eroded to reveal a weak, broken man. He watched as Zuri reached into her purse and pulled out a thick envelope, sliding it across the polished wood until it rested directly in front of him. Next to it, she placed her wedding ring, the 3-carat diamond she had retrieved from Lexi's abandoned clutch. She didn't slide the ring. She set it down with a deliberate clack, the sound final and absolute. Ethan stared at the divorce papers, his hands shaking as he reached out, trying to cover Zuri's hand with his own, desperate for a connection, for a shred of the warmth he had foolishly thrown away. "Zuri, please," he rasped, his voice cracking. "I didn't know about the fake pregnancy. I didn't know she was using me. I was tricked, Zuri. I was a victim too." Zuri recoiled from his touch as if his skin were coated in acid, pulling her hand back and clasping it in her lap. She looked at him, really looked at him, and realized that she didn't hate him. Hate required energy. What she felt was a profound disappointment and the liberating realization that she had outgrown him years ago. "You weren't tricked, Ethan," Zuri said, her voice quiet but hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "You were greedy. You wanted the wife who built the empire and the mistress who stroked your ego. You wanted to have your cake and eat it too, and you didn't care that you were destroying me to do it. Don't insult my intelligence by playing the victim. You aren't the man I married anymore. You're just a liability I am liquidating." She stood up then, smoothing the front of her dress, looking tall and invincible in the dim light. She didn't wait for his response, didn't wait for the inevitable begging or the bargaining. She turned her back on him, walking out of the dining room and leaving him alone with the cold dinner, the divorce papers, and the ring that belonged to a marriage that no longer existed. As she climbed the stairs to the guest room, the only neutral ground left in the house, Zuri felt a weight lift from her shoulders, the heavy, suffocating blanket of gaslighting finally thrown off, replaced by the clean, sharp air of freedom. The transformation of the Mallory estate did not happen with a whisper, but with the roar of industrial vacuums and the rhythmic thud of heavy boots on the hardwood floors, as a team of movers hauled away the physical remnants of the betrayal. Zuri stood in the center of the master bedroom, holding a cup of herbal tea, watching dispassionately as the custom king-sized mattress, the one she had purchased with Ethan 3 years ago, and the one Lexi had defiled, was maneuvered awkwardly through the double doors to be taken to the dump. It was an expensive piece of furniture, costing more than some cars, but to Zuri, it was radioactive waste that needed to be purged to let the house breathe again. She had ordered the walls to be repainted from the stifling beige Ethan preferred to a crisp, airy shade of dove gray, and as the painters rolled the fresh color over the plaster, Zuri felt as though they were sealing away the toxicity of the past 6 months, layer by layer. The house, which had felt like a suffocating museum of lies upon her return, was slowly regaining its pulse, vibrating with the energy of a woman who was no longer asking for permission to exist in her own space. Downstairs, the living room had been radically reimagined. The heavy velvet drapes that Lexi had likely admired were gone, replaced by sheer linen curtains that allowed the California sunlight to flood the room, bleaching out the shadows where secrets used to hide. Above the fireplace, where the fake ultrasound had once been displayed like a trophy, now hung a massive, vibrant, abstract painting Zuri had commissioned from a local artist, a chaotic, beautiful explosion of cobalts and golds that represented life, messy and unapologetic. Vivian arrived around noon, but the dynamic had shifted tectonically. She no longer breezed in with the entitlement of a matriarch, but rang the doorbell and waited to be let in by the new housekeeper Zuri had hired. Vivian carried a casserole dish, a humble offering of lasagna that smelled of oregano and contrition, and she looked smaller, her posture hunched under the weight of her shame. When she saw the children, Mia and Jonah, playing on the floor with a complex Lego set, she hesitated, looking to Zuri for a cue. Zuri didn't smile warmly, nor did she scowl. She simply nodded, a benevolent monarch granting an audience, allowing Vivian to sit on the edge of the sofa and engage with her grandchildren. The conversation was polite, restricted to safe topics like school grades and the weather, and when Vivian tried to steer the talk toward Ethan's current living situation, Zuri effectively shut it down with a silence so profound that Vivian quickly retreated back to discussing the lasagna. It was a clear boundary. Vivian was welcome as a grandmother, but her tenure as a meddling influencer in Zuri's life had been permanently revoked. Ethan's reality, by contrast, was a stark study in reduction. He was living in a serviced apartment complex 3 towns over, a sterile beige box that was a far cry from the architectural marvel he had lost, forcing him to confront his own mediocrity without Zuri's wealth to cushion him. When he arrived to pick up the twins for his court-mandated weekend visitation, he looked haggard, his designer suit fitting a little looser than before, the arrogance that had defined him completely eroded by the humiliation of the public divorce proceedings. He stood in the foyer, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his eyes scanning the renovated space with a mixture of awe and regret, realizing too late that the house's elegance had always come from Zuri's taste, not his. He tried to linger, asking Zuri about her work, about the new painting, fishing for any scrap of emotional engagement. But Zuri treated him with the professional detachment one might offer a delivery driver. She handed him the children's overnight bags, gave Mia and Jonah a kiss, and closed the door firmly before he could finish his sentence, denying him the satisfaction of knowing he could still affect her. With the house empty of children and ex-husband, Zuri did not collapse into loneliness as she might have feared months ago. Instead, she unrolled her yoga mat in the center of the living room, right on the spot where Lexi had once stood cutting the cake. The late afternoon sun pooled on the floor, warming her skin as she moved into a warrior pose, her muscles trembling with effort, her breath flowing in a steady rhythmic tide. This practice was her reclamation, a physical assertion that this ground belonged to her, that her body was strong, and that her mind was no longer a frantic prisoner of gaslighting. As she stretched her arms toward the ceiling, expanding her chest, she felt a profound sense of lightness, a realization that the betrayal hadn't broken her. It had merely burned away the dead wood, leaving her stripped back to her most essential, indestructible self. Later that evening, Zuri stepped out onto the master balcony, wrapping a cashmere shawl around her shoulders against the coastal breeze. The estate grounds below were immaculate, the pool glowing a soft turquoise in the twilight, the landscape finally free of the flashy, tacky modifications Lexi had tried to implement. She looked down the winding driveway and saw the tail lights of Ethan's sedan disappearing through the gates, taking the children for the weekend. In the past, this sight would have triggered a panic attack or a spiral of grief, a desperate need to know what they were doing and if they missed her. But tonight, Zuri felt a strange, quiet emotion that she eventually identified as indifference. It wasn't anger, and it certainly wasn't hate, because hate would imply that Ethan still held power over her emotions. It was simply a lack of caring, a neutral void where her anxiety used to live. She realized that by trying to replace her, they had inadvertently set her free. They had shown her exactly who they were, allowing her to stop carrying the burden of their happiness. Zuri took a sip of her water, the cool liquid refreshing her throat, and turned her back on the driveway, walking back into the warmth of her bright, beautiful bedroom. She had a board meeting in the morning, a trip to Paris to plan for the spring, and a life that was finally, entirely, and wonderfully her own. The mistress had wanted the mansion, and the husband had wanted the fantasy, but in the end, they were just temporary squatters in the kingdom Zuri had built, and the queen had finally returned to sit on her throne. And that brings the curtain down on Zuri's masterpiece of revenge. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Zuri's cold, calculated silence was more powerful than a screaming match? How would you have handled a betrayal of this magnitude in your own home? Let us know your thoughts and your favorite moment of justice in the comments below. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. Until the next story unfolds, take care.